So this story happened when I was a paramedic. I was the chief of a county ambulance service in North Idaho, Sandpoint, Idaho, Bonner County EMS. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was hanging around the station, one of our stations, visiting with the crews that were on duty. And usually when I did that, if they got a call, I would usually tag along with them. I responded to as many calls as I could when I was the chief of that service, because they hired me as I was a very new green paramedic. That year I had just become licensed as a paramedic, and they weren't hiring me because I was a paramedic. They were hiring me for my management experience, budgeting experience. They didn't even require that the chief that they hire really respond to any calls. They wanted a manager. That's why they hired me, and I said, I'll do it if I can respond to calls and I can use the experienced people that work for me to teach me. I want to learn. I find it interesting, fascinating, the work, and everyone agreed. So I was responding to calls frequently, and they were kind enough. They got me training that was more applicable to officer level or chief officer level, like incident command. They sent me to several higher level incident command federal courses, and I learned a lot. You often will arrive on a scene, and if you're the most senior person there, you'd be required to take command of the situation until someone with more experience arrives, and hence you would turn over command to that more experienced person. And most often, where I was, a fire chief would be in command. It was a county, 2,000 square miles, and my service did EMS ambulance transport throughout that entire county, and there were 9 fire districts and 9 fire chiefs within that county. And they did medical first response and rescue and fire. So inevitably, we'd come to a scene, and if it's a scene, an incident that requires an incident commander, it would obviously most often be the fire chief. And occasionally, one of us would get there first, myself or one of my captains, and they would have to take incident command until the fire chief or a deputy chief, someone arrived. Usually a temporary thing, but it's always a good learning experience. So this afternoon, we got a call for a car accident, and it seemed unique for 2 reasons. One, that it was on a highway that ran next to, on one side, the lake, the huge lake, Lake Monterey. On the other side was like I can't say a river, but another body of water, like a slough. And the call came out that the car was in the water, which raises the urgency quite a bit. And the tone of the dispatcher seemed alarmed and excited, which was rare. If you are a first responder and you hear excitement in the voice of a dispatcher, especially one that you know who the dispatcher is and you know they're experienced, and you hear that change in their voice, you suddenly begin to think rightfully that I'm about to arrive to some very serious stuff. So, sure enough, I arrived on scene, and the first thing I see is a 2-year-old blonde girl lying on her back in the middle of the road with a couple of bystanders standing over her, and she wasn't moving. So I pulled my vehicle over the ambulance and the on-duty paramedic. Again, this is someone that worked for me, but it was a guy named Joe, and Joe was, at the time, the most experienced paramedic in our agency. And he had more than 20 years in a very busy system, Spokane, Washington. So he was the right man for this job, and he immediately went with his crew to this little girl, and they started working on her, and I could tell right away they're doing CPR. This little girl is technically dead, and they're trying to bring her back. And the next thing I noticed is the back of a car sticking up out of the water, and many bystanders. And I realized this is a big scene. I need to take command. So I got on the radio and I established command. And I remembered in my training, the instructor said to me, "You're going to be tempted to jump in and help people do things. That is not your job. If you're doing that, you're not doing your job. Your job is to take in the whole scene, make sure that you know what's going on everywhere. Your head needs to be on a swivel. And the thing to do is to find a good vantage point, plant yourself there, and pretend your left foot is hammered with a nail into the ground. And rotate around that foot. Don't move from there." So I remember that. I stayed in that one spot. And I swiveled around and took in what was going on. So I see the car. I see a woman with a head injury sitting on a guardrail. She's conscious and alert. She's talking to someone. She's breathing. I said, okay, she's hurt, but she's okay at the moment. And then I see there's an embankment with tall grass, and I see a bunch of people over that embankment, and I could barely see, and I did break my rule, and I walked up to see what they were around, and there was a 5-year-old boy that appeared to be just as lifeless as the girl. So there were maybe 5 of my people working on this 2-year-old, and I picked the most experienced one that wasn't the paramedic, the most experienced one that I could pull off of that, and I pulled him off that. He was not happy. Try pulling a firefighter away from a lifeless 2-year-old child, and you will have a fight on your hands. I had to yell at him and finally convince him, look, there's another child over here. You need to get over there. And he went over and started initiating patient care on the 5-year-old. In the meantime, fire truck shows up, and it's a fire district where I'm good friends with the fire chief, and something in me said, thank God, as soon as my fire chief friend Brad walked up to me, because I was about to turn over command to him, and he said, Rob, I'm shorthanded, I have to go in the water, and my deputy needs to go with me. You need to keep command of this scene. I said, okay. So I was now going to be stuck with being the incident commander here. And I did have resources coming in from 2 directions, and none of them were there yet. I initiated Lifeline, a helicopter, and I had the option of either landing them at the hospital, which was about 5 miles straight shot down the highway, or landing them in the highway. And so I still had that option in the back of my head. They were coming in, and it turns out very quickly that the 5-year-old was semi-conscious but breathing. And I noticed that Joe, the paramedic, was still working, still doing CPR, and he wanted to load and go. He didn't want to wait for the helicopter. He wanted to just go the 5 miles, go straight to the hospital. And he said, Chief, if you could have the helicopter land on top of the hospital, that'd be great. It didn't have a second. I did have a second ambulance, but if I sent the 5-year-old in that ambulance, I had two problems. I had more than one problem. One, the woman with the head injury, that could go south at any moment, and I could need that ambulance really badly. And it wasn't clear yet if there were still kids or other people in that car. They were just starting to get out to the car. So they had that little girl in the back of that ambulance, and there were like 4 providers. And I knew there were going to be free hands, and the 5-year-old looked fairly stable. So I just said, look, there was a bench, and in a pinch you can transport 2 patients. I said, can you guys just take the kid too? Because they were on the road, pointed toward there. They were literally 5 minutes from the hospital, and they said yes. So that ambulance left. Maybe 5 or 10 minutes later, another ambulance arrived on the scene. We discovered that there was no one else in the car, and the woman was still stable. But an odd thing happened. The state trooper that was there, I did mention this happened before they loaded up the 2-year-old. He came up to me, and he was absolutely frantic. And I'd never seen him frantic, or I'd never seen the guy emotional. He was a seasoned Idaho state trooper. And he was a wreck. And he said, he's like, I'm standing there doing the incident command thing. My guys are all working on the little girl. And he's like, you got to do something. You got to save that little girl. Really, you got to do something. You got to do something now. And I'm like, man, the best paramedic I have is working on it. Everything that can be done. So I was like really puzzled by this trooper's reaction, because it was totally out of character. And so I mentioned that there was no one else in the vehicle. The woman had a minor head laceration. The next ambulance came in. I put her on that. They got her to the hospital. They cleaned everything up. I left and went to the hospital. And somebody walked up to me in the ER and said, Chief, they need you upstairs in such and such a room. The little girl is up there, the deceased little girl. But okay, so I went up there and I walked in, and this beautiful little girl is laid out on a bed with her blonde hair, and she's deceased. And the trooper is up there, and I think a nurse or a doctor. And for the life of me, I can't remember what they wanted from me. They wanted some question answered, and I did that. But the trooper was a train wreck. I mean, he wasn't saying anything, but I could tell he was gone. And I was, I asked him if it was okay, if anything I could do, and he kind of left me off. And like I said, it was completely out of character. And I remember very clearly how that little girl looked lying on that bed. And she, they hadn't covered her up or anything. Yeah. Fast forward 2 weeks, and I was on a committee at the hospital where every year for the graduating seniors in the high school, we would do a whole DUI program, a big dramatic demonstration. The whole idea is to educate kids on driving under the influence, and how you can take a celebration of graduating from high school and turn it into the ultimate tragedy. And this trooper was part of that committee. And he was late that day, and I looked at the door open, I looked up, and he was walking in. He was off duty, he didn't have a uniform on. He walked in, and I looked down, and holding his hand is his little 2-year-old daughter, who was the spitting image of the girl that died on that scene. Hi, I'm Dottie, and I need more subscribers. They're not out there, Dottie. They're in.